Well, let's discuss briefly where we were the last time we read Ursula's book, which was about 8,000 years ago. If you remember, Mona had found the small, scrawny child who was absolutely convinced that his sister, who could turn invisible, could not have been murdered. Yeah, he was disappointed. Reluctantly teaming up with the kid, whose name I have forgotten to note down, but I seem to remember is Spindle. Yes. Reluctantly teaming up with Spindle, Mona then planned to. Mona then went back to the bakery, got the evidence, and yeah, things things are bad. Oh, also there was the fantastic dead horse and knackering mole. Also, yes, as we move into the story, a reminder of content warnings. There will be frequent threat, persistent murder mystery, implied violence, and mild swashbuckling. I think about covers it.
Yeah, but nothing. There's nothing graphically on screen.
There's nothing graphically on screen or on page. It's worrying, but it's not scream-inducing. So,
Where are we?
Chapter 10. Everyone got water? Everyone taking any meds they need?
Oh,
you got,
yes.
You got
Also,
some food?
content warnings, accents.
Content warning. Voices. Okay, we're going to have a word with Alcyon 3's dog. There's some foot attacking going on
I'm
here.
very sorry to hear that. Yes, this is a good time to make sure you've refilled your drink, you have a snack, stream snack.
Stream snack.
Off we go.
And off we go. Chapter 10. I didn't see Spindle for a couple of days after that. I was busy in the bakery. Not that Aunt Tabitha wouldn't let me have the time off, but I didn't want to. Baking was normal. If it was baking, then everyone else was normal too. And even if somebody was killing wizards, it was happening somewhere else, on the other side of the counter. This was maybe not as rational as it could have been, but it felt right. I was safe at the bakery. When I walked home at night, the block to the glass blower with the water gurgling from the gutters into the canal, then I wasn't safe. I hunched myself into my jacket. I felt like things were following me in the shadows. I didn't run home. Running would have let whatever was in the shadows chase me. Now that wasn't rational either. This was a slightly more grown-up version of monsters hiding under the bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling. So I stayed in the bakery as much as possible, and I hurried home at a fast walk that never quite broke into a run, and I got up very, very, very early and came into the bakery again, so that when Aunt Tabitha came downstairs, I was already wrist-deep in dough. I worried about Spindle, though, in the moments when I wasn't too busy to think. Not that there was any shortage of things to worry about. The news that spring was all bad. Lord Ethan and the army marched out not 2 days after I'd seen him. Carrick's mercenaries raiding again, I think. The customers had different ideas. Miss McGrammer just called them the enemy. Brutus the Chandler said it was Maniqua, the next province over, hiring the Carricks to attack us. The priest waited until the Chandler had left with his scones and told me that was nonsense. Nobody hired the Carricks for anything anymore, unless you were paying them to go away. Now, Carrick's mercenaries are sort of like the boogeymen in our city, and actually most of the cities in the kingdom. Your mom tells you that if you misbehave, the Carricks will get you. The problem is that they're actually real, and once you grow up and hear all the stories, you realise they're a lot worse than the boogeymen. A long time ago, supposedly, they had their own homeland, and then 2 of the city-states went to war, Edom, I think, and St. Salisbury, or maybe it was Delta City, and one of the cities hired the Carricks to fight for them. When the war was over, the Carricks decided they liked it here, and they just didn't leave. Apparently their homeland is all ice and mountains and things trying to kill you, so you can see why they'd want to stick around our kingdom, which has lots of farmland and rivers and high-quality baked goods. Don't get me wrong, generally we like foreigners in our kingdom. We like anybody as long as they have money and buy scones. Some of the big port cities are crammed with people from all over the world, and they don't make them live in their own quarter the way they do Magickas. The man who sells Aunt Tabitha cinnamon is from some place that nobody else can pronounce quite right, and he has tattoos all over his skin, even on the little webs in between his fingers. But the Carracks eat all the farm animals, even the horses, even the dogs, sometimes the people, and then they burn the farms for fun. They are not interested in being neighbours. They just take over towns and eat all the food and kill all the people, and then use it as a base to launch raids on other towns. Whenever that happens, the nearest cities send out the army and burn them out, and the Carracks run back to the hills for a couple of seasons and then come out, meaner, hungrier than ever before. It was probably just my imagination that the city seemed colder without the Golden General in it. I felt less safe without the war wizards around. You didn't want to need them, and they had scary powers in their own right, like calling lightning and throwing fireballs, but you liked to know they were there, just in case. One thing I didn't worry about was what the army would do when they found the Carracks, because the army would win, no question. We have magic and the Carracks don't. Carracks hate magicers. If one of their kids turns up with a talent, they expose him. For the longest time, I didn't know what that meant, but it turns out they just leave him on a hillside and they let wild animals eat him. That's the sort of thing that makes you glad to live in a civilized city. The regulars all have their own opinions, but one I didn't hear was Master Elwich's. He hadn't come into the bakery in days. I was getting a little worried about him. So I went to the farmer's market one morning, and then something happened that worried me even more.
Sorry.
There's a girl at the farmer's market who's a magicka like me. I actually think she's a lot better, honestly. She's a juggler, but when she juggles oranges, they turn blue or green or seem to catch fire. Her dad sells fruit, and every now and then she'll take out a few oranges and start juggling, and people will come over to watch. In late summer, she'll turn rutabagas into doves. Her name's Elena. She's older than me and lives outside of town, and we don't talk very much, so I was surprised when Elena saw me across the crowd and came over. She wasn't juggling oranges. Not today. "You're Mona, aren't you?" she said, "from the bakery." "Yes," I said. She nodded once, sharply, then looked around as if afraid that someone might be listening. She pulled me forward to the edge of the market against one of the brick walls. "Are you leaving?" she said. I have to buy some strawberries for my aunt." No, she shook her head. "The city. Are you leaving the city?" "Why would I leave the city?" I asked, baffled. "You know," she said, waving a hand all around us as if to take in the entire city. No? I was starting to feel like I'd come in on this conversation halfway through. "What do I know?" Elena blew air through her bangs, making them flip up. "Haven't you been hearing? The disappearances, She looked around again. "The magickas." "Well, knackering Molly said something," I said cautiously, "but we're getting out," said Elena. "Dad and me, we're leaving tonight. There's something going on in this city. It's not healthy for magickas anymore. We're going to Dad's cousins in Edom." She looked me over appraisingly. "We're taking the Wainwright's boy, too, the one who turns rocks into cheese. You should come with us as well." "What? No!" I took a step back, as if she might try to kidnap me. "My aunt and uncle are here, and the bakery." I took another step back. I mean, it can't be that bad. Could it? I tried to think of all the magickas I knew. There weren't many. Elena, Molly, Elwich. There was the girl who sang on the street corner and birds came down and sang with her. No, she'd been gone since last winter, hadn't she? There'd been a man with a hurdy-gurdy on that street corner for months now. Still, even if Elena was right, I was 14 years old. Leave the bakery? That's just nuts. Elena narrowed her eyes. I took another step back. She didn't have any rutabagas on her, but I wasn't sure what she could do with a strawberry. I needed those strawberries for tarts. If they turned into doves, it was going to be a real problem. I thought she might yell at me, but she shook her head and said, "Good luck then. I hope you're right." She hurried back to the fruit stand. On the way home with my strawberries, I took Peony Street, which takes you past the shop where Master Elwich, the carpenter, works. The door was closed. There were no lights in the window. It looked like an empty shop, not just a closed one. I went home as fast as I could, feeling yet again that there was something watching me in the shadows. I didn't tell Aunt Tabitha about the conversation. Probably she'd say that Elena was being ridiculous, but what if she didn't? And if she took it seriously, then I'd have to take it seriously, and that meant that I wasn't safe. Not behind the bakery counter. Not anywhere. Those were really depressing thoughts. So I threw myself into work at the bakery, but there was only so much I could do. When the pans had gone in the oven and it wasn't time for anything else to come out, when I had to wait 10 minutes before I started the icing for the cinnamon buns, when there weren't any customers, then I had a few minutes, and then the thoughts would start again. I'd steal downstairs and feed Bob, or if he'd already been fed, I'd lean my forehead against the cool stone wall and let the thoughts bubble and ferment like yeast at the bottom of my mind. Sometimes Bob would put out a mushy tentacle of dough and touch me on the shoulder. I think he knew I was worried. Occasionally he'd even drag his bucket closer to where I was sitting and brooding. It wasn't exactly thinking, if that makes any sense. I wasn't looking at the thoughts, I just knew they were there, rolling around underneath. Problem was that, like yeast, the thoughts were growing. Pretty soon, they'd overflow the edges of my skull, and I would not be able to ignore them any longer. For the moment, though, I could sort of smash them down, like dough into a pan, and think about something else. I settled for worrying about Spindle. I left day-old bakery goods out for him on the stoop a couple of times. They were gone in the morning, although it could have been dogs or raccoons or some other street kid. That was fine. Dogs and raccoons and street kids all have to eat, and the day-olds don't do anybody any good in any case. 5 or 6 days after my trip to the palace, I went down to the Rookshade Bridge with a half loaf of stale bread. Rookshade is a really good bridge for feeding the ducks, because it's low to the water and the railing has wide enough gaps that you can dangle your feet through and throw bits of bread down to the ducks. It was a nice afternoon. It wasn't raining for once. We'd had a really damp spring, and Aunt Tabitha had told me to get out of the bakery and go take a break before she hit me over the head and forced me to relax. I walked down the road by the side of the canal, avoiding the carriages and the wheeled carts selling hot buns. Nothing so good as our hot buns, by the way, with the Gingerbread Man sitting on my shoulder. He was the same one from the night Spindle and I had found his sister's bracelet, and he was so stale by now that you'd probably break your teeth if you tried to bite him. I didn't expect him to be walking around still, but I'd been pretty upset that night looking for Tibby. It had been a really awful day, and when I was upset, my magic worked a lot harder, or better, or something. I should probably have figured that out with Bob, the unkillable sourdough starter, but it was still a surprise. At any rate, the Gingerbread Man showed no signs of stopping. That was fine by me. I kept him sitting on the bedpost at night, watching the door. He was supposed to wake me up if anybody tried to get in. I don't know how well that would really work, but I did feel a little better because of it. Aunt Tabitha hadn't said anything, even when the cookie started displaying a little more initiative than was usual in baked goods. Twice he had brought me the salt without even asking, and I could tell him to put strawberry halves on top of the muffins, and he would do the entire tray. I'd been tempted occasionally to try baking a life-size gingerbread man to help out in the kitchen. Fortunately, the ovens weren't big enough for that, and I was becoming glad of it. You see, my little gingerbread familiar was fairly benign, but what if I was upset or nervous and wound up creating some kind of berserk gingerbread golem? It didn't seem likely that I could do that, but, well, best not to find out. Besides, between Lena and knackering Molly warning me, I was starting to think that it was best not to call attention to my magic. A person-sized hunk of gingerbread wasn't very subtle, and lately when I'd made cookies dance, there had been an edge to the laughter. We threw out 3 batches of old gingerbread men. Hardly anybody was willing to buy them. It's maybe not so odd that gingerbread doesn't sell in midsummer, but 1 or 2 customers left without buying anything. And then there was Miss McGrammer. "Have you seen the broadsheets yet?" she snapped when everybody else had left the shop. The what? I put the cookie back in the bakery case. You'll see, she said, sniffing. She sounded maliciously pleased about something. All you people will see soon enough. She hadn't explained, and she hadn't come back since. Nobody missed her, but it was still strange. On the bright side, she was the only reason we baked lemon scones every day, so instead, I started making Blackberry Tarts, and those were much better. I trudged up the railing of the Rookshade Bridge, and I saw Spindle already sitting there, staring moodily down into the water. I caught a glimpse of him once or twice, but this time he didn't run off as soon as he saw me. The ducks had gathered under him, expecting to be fed, and the fact he wasn't throwing anything down was inciting some pretty angry quacking. I sat down next to him. The gingerbread man steadied himself by holding onto the rim of my ear. Spindle didn't say anything. Neither did I. I pulled some stale bread out of my pocket and began tossing bits down to the ducks. I handed Spindle half the loaf. He took the slices wordlessly and put them in his pockets. Well, so much for that idea. I finished tossing bits down to the ducks and dusted off my hands. You doing okay? I asked. He shrugged. It was a stupid question. Tibby was dead. It would never be okay that she was dead. My parents had been dead for years now, ever since the cold fever, and it still wasn't going to be okay. It would never be okay, but I guess that's just how it goes. Those are very heavy things for a 14-year-old baker to have to think. So we sat there in silence while the ducks nosed around the water for any bits they'd missed. A cart rolled by behind us with a crunch of wheels and a clop of hooves. The gingerbread man peered out from under my hair. Spindle glanced over at me, looked at the cookie, but didn't comment. We haven't heard anything back about the investigation yet, I said finally. Truth is, I don't even know if there is an investigation. They wanted me to be guilty, and when I wasn't, I don't know if anybody's doing anything. Nobody ever does anything, said Spindle quietly. Not for people like us. I wanted to say something encouraging. I wanted to promise him that the guards would find the killer. I wanted to be strong and hopeful and determined. It was hard to believe any of that when I thought about Tibby and her mismatched socks. I'm really sorry, I said, and flicked a pebble into the dark water of the canal. A duck grabbed for it, saw that it wasn't edible, and let out a very loud quack of annoyance. She had to cut her hair real short one winter, said Spindle. He wasn't looking at me, and I was afraid to say anything, for fear that he'd stop. Tibby, she couldn't sneak if there was too much light. Lamplighter came round the corner with a lantern just when she was coming out the second-story window, and there was a constable on the corner, and he got a look at her. They went looking for a girl with real long hair, so she had to cut it. I lifted like a dozen hats for her, and she wore them, but she was never happy till she grew it back out again. He wiped his nose on the collar of his shirt. I told her to be careful, he said, watching the ducks squabble in the water below. I told her. We've been hearing about the magicers, you know how they're turning up dead. Somebody got Willy Thumbs last week, and he wasn't half the magic as she was. She said she'd be careful, but it didn't matter. He didn't say anything else. I couldn't think of anything to say. I didn't know any of these people, and yet, after hearing Elena talk about leaving the city... After a while, I got up and dusted myself off. If you need anything, I said. Spindle looked at me with dark eyes. His face was pale and smudged, like an unwashed ghost. Be careful, he said. Chapter 11. 4 a.m. again. I woke up to the water clock chiming and pulled the blankets up to my chin. A minute or two later, the big bells tolled the hour, a distant sound that you might not hear if you weren't awake and listening for it. I got up. The gingerbread man sitting sentry on my bedpost gave me a small salute as I stood up. I bundled myself into my clothes, let him climb to his usual perch on my shoulder, and let myself out of the building. The streets were quiet. They often weren't quiet at midnight, but they were quiet now. Everyone walking at this hour had somewhere to be, and they were walking rapidly, with their heads down, their breath frosting in the air. The same way I walked, except most of them didn't have an animate cookie riding on their coat. I got to the bakery, and I unlocked the door. The day-olds were gone from the step again. I started up the ovens, and was crouched down, reaching under the counter to get the dough that had been left to rise overnight, when the door opened behind me. The noise was so unexpected that I jumped and banged my head on the underside of the table. I staggered back a step, rubbing the top of my skull, and I suspect that saved my life, because the knife that had been about to go into my ribs whooshed through the air instead. I stared at the blade stupidly, and then the hand holding it, which was coming out of a pale yellow-green sleeve, and my eyes travelled up the sleeve to the shoulder and the face, and I looked into the eyes of the spring green man. His eyes were almost the same colour as his clothes, an unnaturally light green, the pupils dilated in a pale, seamed face. There was a weird smell coming off him too, something heavy and spicy, like incense, and made it hard to breathe and harder to think. Excuse me? I said stupidly, as if I'd caught him manhandling the baguettes or trying to open the bakery case, not trying to stab me. Trying to stab me probably deserved something other than excuse me, but my brain really didn't seem to be working. My body, however, just fine. My body realised I was standing in the kitchen with a murderer, and before I'd quite worked out what I was supposed to do next, my body took over, spun me around, and sent me at high speed down the stairs into the basement. It was dark. I hadn't taken a light. It was black as pitch, and even though I walked through this room at least 3 times a day, suddenly I couldn't remember where anything was. I tripped over a pile of baking pans and I knocked them down with a clatter. The spring green man laughed at me from the top of the stairs. His voice wasn't deep. It was thin and sharp, like his knife. Do you think you can hide from me in the dark? That was exactly what I was thinking, although I didn't seem to be doing it well. I tried to disentangle myself from the baking pans and I kicked one instead. The clang seemed to go up my entire spine. My mind seemed to be working again, but it wasn't doing much except gibbering. Oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, he's got a knife, oh God. I can smell you, said the spring green man, taking a step down the stairs. The boards creaked. I can smell your magic, little bread wizard. I got away from the traitorous baking pans and scurried deeper into the basement, hands held out in front of me to feel my way. I would have gotten you eventually, said the voice from the stairs. Another step, another creak. I'll get you all eventually. But that little thief brat ran in here, and I couldn't drag her back out without a guard seeing, and that moved you up the list. So to speak. A list? There was a list? How many people were on the list? I found the edge of the big drying rack where we keep the onions and garlic and felt my way around the end. The scent of garlic helped clear the weirdly heavy smell of incense out of my lungs. Unfortunately, being more clear-headed only meant that I was more clear on being in a basement with a murderer standing in the only doorway. You should feel privileged. You aren't nearly powerful enough to warrant being eliminated so soon. Another step down. Creak. How many steps were there? Gods and saints, I spent most of my life going up and down those stairs. How did I not know how many stairs there were? If that idiot Oberon had taken care of you like he was supposed to, I probably wouldn't be bothering with you at all. You're almost nothing. Creak. Creak. But no, he makes a mess and I have to clean it up. Creak. Oberon. Inquisitor Oberon. I sure hadn't liked him, but what did he have to do with the spring green man? Creak. I had an idea. It wasn't a good idea, and it was probably going to get me killed, but the only other idea I had was to wait until he was fully in the cellar and try to sneak past him, and that really wasn't much better. I slid along the wall, hopefully... I'm sorry, I bet he looks like a 5-year-old tried to draw Ben Shapiro from memory. That is the best. Okay, we're back. I slid along the wall, hopefully far enough, and crouched down. I felt around me, hoping I'd been right, hoping I'd got far enough back. There. Creak. You can't hide, little bread wizard. I don't need light to find you. Then he giggled. I'm going to be honest with you, I wet myself a little when he giggled. That was a sound that signaled not just a murderer like some of the thugs in the rat's nest, but someone who enjoyed killing people. That giggle went straight into the pit of my stomach and played the xylophone on my ribcage. It was completely dark, but there were bright slashes behind my eyes, and my heart wasn't so much pounding as drumming, like a woodpecker on a drain pipe. I think I came close to fainting, and if I had, there wouldn't be much more to read than this, but I didn't. Instead, I wet myself, which was getting off lightly. I wasn't even embarrassed. If there's a killer coming after you with a knife, embarrassment doesn't register. There wasn't another creak. Instead, I heard the scuffing of footsteps over stone. He was at the bottom of the stairs. He was moving into the cellar. I put one hand over my mouth because my own breathing sounded incredibly loud, and I hunched myself into the smallest ball I could. I had one weapon and only one chance to use it. The gingerbread man gripped the edge of my ear and shifted slightly on my shoulder. You're over there, in the corner, crooned the spring green man, walking slowly towards me. I can smell it. Little fool. How did you manage to outwit Oberon? Please, I thought, a desperate and incoherent prayer. For some reason, the only person I could think of to pray to was the statue on the front of the church I had passed walking home from the palace, Our Lady of Sorrowful Angels. I didn't want to be an angel, sorrowful or otherwise. Please, please. The footsteps were right on top of me. I held my breath and I clenched my fingers. Got you! Crowed the spring green man as he took a last step forward, and I flung the bucket with Bob the sourdough starter over him. The man screamed. It was shock at first, and then it was pain, because Bob was mad. I'd pumped as much of my panic and terror into the dough as I could. Attack is not a command I've ever given to Bread before, but if those rats last winter were any indication, Bob knew what to do. The spring green man screamed again, and I heard flailing and a crash as he staggered into something. There were globs of sourdough on my clothes. I didn't wait around to see what had happened. I took off for the steps, somehow avoiding the baking pans, and shot up the stairs like a rabbit. Mona, this way, hissed a voice from the door. Spindle! Come on, he beckoned furiously. The spring green man is after you. He came in here. I know! I raced to the door, and I think he might be working with Oberon. We have to get on top of... Do you want him to kill her too? It was like being slapped. I sucked in a lungful of frosty air so hard it hurt. But, come on, there's no time. He turned and ran. I wavered for a second. No more heard the basement stairs creaking and took off after him. We pounded through the streets, skidding on the frost-lit cobbles. I kept my eyes fixed on the back of Spindle's jacket. I didn't dare look around. If I looked around, I might lose him. Spindle took a route as twisty as a baked pretzel. But more importantly, I might look behind me and see the face of my pursuer. It was probably stupid on me, in a morning full of stupidities, but I kept worrying about whether Bob had survived. On the run for my life and fretting over a sourdough starter, it could only happen to me. I realised that a lot of people wouldn't even consider Bob to be alive as such, but I'd grown attached to him. We ran for at least 3 blocks, and I couldn't keep it up. Slow down. Wait. Please. There was a stitch in my side, so painful I wondered if I hadn't been stabbed after all. Spindle twisted his head around, looking annoyed. What, already? Please! He slowed to a fast walk, and I gasped, killed. I shook my head, clutching at my side. Did it matter if we ran? The spring green man had said he could smell my magic. Did that mean he could track me like some kind of evil bloodhound? I managed to glance around this time, before we plunged into yet another alleyway. We were off Rat's Elbow and going in deeper. I didn't even protest. While somebody in there might decide to kill me, somebody out here had already tried. It was scary in the rat's nest, though. The buildings weren't just run down, they were falling apart. Some of them were burned out, and some of them had collapsed completely. Even the ones that were just piles of rubble showed signs of life, though. There was a clothesline running from a hole in a pile of rock to a pillar. Somebody was actually living in the rubble. There was a dead dog in the middle of the street. It was only barely light enough to see it, and I might have missed it, but Spindle detoured around it. It had been a big dog. It was too much. In the morning, it had already been too much. I threw up. After a couple of seconds, I felt somebody pull my hair back. When I looked up, shaky and sweating, it was Spindle. Thanks, I mumbled, wiping up my mouth. He shrugged. I felt a little better. Not much. I felt cold, mostly. I hadn't grabbed my jacket on the way out to the bakery, and the wet patch on my pants was freezing. People weren't staring at me here the way they had in the Rat's Elbow. There weren't many people out, but there was a little cluster at the mouth of every alley, and when I looked up, there were people crouched on the edges of the buildings too. They were watching the street. Not just us, though we were the biggest and most obvious things on the street at the moment, particularly given the vomiting, but they were watching everything. They were guards. No, not guards. They were sentries. They were people who were watching to see who and what was coming into the rat's nest, and if they saw anything, they were going to alert more people. Given where we were, I did not want to know what those other people would look like or what kind of weapons they might be carrying. Where are we going? I asked, trying to keep up with Spindle. He had slowed to a brisk walk. Away. Nobody comes near who don't belong here. I didn't belong in here, but it didn't seem like the right time to say so. Fortunately, somebody else said it for me. Mona! Spindle! What are you doing in here? The voice was familiar, as was the clunk, clunk, clunk on the stones. I looked up gratefully into the dead face of Nag and the bird's nest tangle of Knackering Molly. This is no place for you, girl, or you either, Spindle, even if you think you're tough. Spindle jerked his head, rolled his eyes. I put a hand on Nag's shoulder and tried to think of something to say, and I couldn't come up with anything for a minute. Molly tilted her head down and looked at me. Go, you all right? Somebody just tried to kill me, I whispered, feeling tears squeeze out of the sides of my eyes. A single, painful sob escaped, and I stuffed the side of my hand into my mouth, because the rat's nest did not seem like a good place to cry at all. Molly's mad eyes softened. She rooted around in the nest on Nag's back and dropped a blanket across my shoulders. It was old and tattered, and it didn't smell very good, but neither did I. And it was warm, which was the important thing. Come on, she said. Grab it on the Nag's tail. Let's get you someplace a little safer. You can tell Molly all about it. She nudged Nag forwards, the skeletal tail twitching in front of me, bones wrapped in old ribbons with bits of stiff horse hair sticking out around the edges. Not the most appealing handhold, but I grabbed on. It felt like holding a bag full of twigs. The gingerbread man climbed right up Nag's tail and sat on one of the horse's hip bones. He kicked his heels as if to say, "Giddy up!" Spindle muttered something under his breath, but he followed behind us anyway. We let the dead horse lead us into the twists and turns and alleys of the rat's nest. Significant water. Knackering Molly listened to my whole story, and she didn't ask any Chapter 12, sorry. Knackering Molly listened to my whole story, and she didn't ask any embarrassing questions like why I thought attacking somebody with a sourdough starter would work, or why I started crying when I talked about Bob. What if he was dead? I mean, really dead this time? Oh God, what if he died saving me? I mean, you may think it's strange crying over a bucket of yeasty sludge. I know Spindle probably thought I was crazy, but it wasn't just any sludge, it was Bob. He made amazing bread, and he liked me, in so much as sludge likes anybody. Molly understood, though. When you spend most of your time with a dead horse, you learn to respect other people's weird pets. By the time I'd gotten to the end of the story, my nose was dripping. Molly drug a handkerchief out of her pocket and handed it to me. It was dry. Bits of it were unpleasantly crunchy, but I couldn't afford to be picky. "Thanks," I mumbled, blowing my nose. "Sorry." "It's all right, go. You've had a shock and no mistake." Spindle snorted. He was leaning in a corner with his hands shoved into his pockets and a sour expression. I could tell he thought I was being a baby, and that made me pretty mad. I bet nobody had tried to stab him today. I wiped my eyes and sniffed furiously. We were at Knackery Molly's home, or at least one of her homes. She called it a squat, which sounded vaguely rude. It was half a house on the edge of the rat's nest that had fallen over, so one side looked almost normal, and the other side was a crazy quilt of collapsed beams. There were old crates and ragged bits of rug on the floor, and she'd hung burlap sacks over the windows to block them out. It probably wasn't very structurally sound, but since there was a whole horse skeleton stomping around the room, and the rest of the ceiling hadn't fallen in yet, I decided not to worry about it. I had much bigger things to worry about anyway, like what to do next, and how not to be murdered. Okay. I took a deep breath and scrubbed up my face. I didn't want to cry anymore. Crying wouldn't help. What do we do now? We should find the constables or somebody, right? Spindle made a rude sound. Fat lot of help they'll be. Wouldn't be surprised if they sent him after you. Oh, come on. I rolled my eyes. You're telling me you think the constables are conspiring to set assassins on bakers? That Inquisitor Oberon was a bad apple was obvious. The Spring Green Man had said as much, but thinking that people like Constable Alphonse and Constable Montgomery were in league with inquisitors and assassins was ridiculous. They were people. They ate pastries. Alphonse's sister lived on the next street over and came in every market day to buy a scone. They didn't even make signs to ward off bad luck when they thought I wasn't looking. Somebody did it, said Spindle, stubbornly, dropping his chin onto his chest and glaring at me. Guards never care about people like us, as long as we don't make trouble. They're trying to wipe magic us out now, so you don't make trouble. Started with Tibby, and now they're going for you. I appealed to Knackering Molly. Molly, this is nuts. You don't think the constables are behind this, do you? Not the constables, no, said Molly slowly. They're following orders, is all. But somebody's giving those orders. I was hearing rumours about the Spring Green Man on the street before you ever turned up in the Rat's Elbow, girl. I need to ask some questions, maybe call in a few favours. She stood up. You kids stay here a while. Not sure how long I'll be gone. But you're leaving? She swung herself up on Nag, who clomped across the creaky floorboards and out the door. Spindle hurried to yank the burlap curtain aside. Got questions to ask, Baker girl, she shot over her shoulder, and was gone. The clunk, clunk, clunk of Nag's hooves faded into the darkness. It was almost morning, and I could just see the edge of light over the top of the houses, but it hadn't gone down to street level yet. She left. Just like that. I mean, sure, she was a little nuts. Okay. She rode a dead horse. She was a lot nuts, but she was a grown-up, and it seemed like she knew what she was doing. I certainly trusted her judgment a lot more than I trusted Spindle's. And if you were a grown-up, you didn't just leave two kids alone in a house with a madman on the prowl trying to kill them, did you? Apparently Molly did. I probably would have stood in the doorway with my mouth hanging open for 5 minutes, but Spindle dropped the sacking back down and I had to step back. I couldn't help it. I started sniffling again. It wasn't real crying. I wasn't sobbing or anything, but there were some tears, and my chest ached the way it does when you know that a good hard sob is just waiting to get out. I wouldn't let it out, not with Spindle standing there looking at me like it was pathetic. I didn't see what he had to be so smug about anyway. He'd cried after we found Tibby's bracelet, and I hadn't been mean to him about it or anything. He let out an annoyed sigh and flopped down in the corner of the room. I know this struck me as horribly unfair. Sure, he saved my life, and now he was stuck in this shack with me instead of out doing whatever he did. But what did he have to be annoyed about? Nobody was trying to kill him. Sorry this is bothering you, I snapped. I wouldn't have gotten attacked if I'd known it would have been so inconvenient. He flushed and mumbled something. I sat down because there wasn't anything else to do, and we sat in the room in an irritable, crackling silence. I wondered how long it would take Knackering Molly to find out what she wanted to know, or whether the Spring Green Man would find us first. It was definitely getting light out. The edges of the burlap sacking over the windows went from black to grey to a kind of watery tan. Aunt Tabitha would be getting up soon, and she'd wonder where I was. And the bakery was a mess, and Bob was scattered all over the cellar. She'd probably be worried sick. She might not even be able to make cinnamon rolls and sticky buns and gingerbread cookies and set the bread, and oh, my stomach was growling. You wouldn't think that you could be hungry after someone tried to kill you. You'd be wrong. I still got that bread you gave me yesterday, said Spindle. It was probably a peace offering, but I wasn't in the mood to accept it, and anyway I'd have to magic it a lot softer before I could gnaw through bread that stale. I just didn't have the energy right now. No thanks. It's all I got, said Spindle. Unless you want to eat that cookie riding round on your shoulder, it's all we're gonna get. No! I put a hand over the gingerbread man protectively. Nobody eats him. And anyway, he's really stale. The cookie tweaked my ear indignantly at that. Might change your mind soon, said Spindle, smirking. You don't get to be so picky when you're on the lam. The cookie made a rude gesture at him. My stomach growled again for emphasis. I am not on the lam, I said. My chest felt hot and tight, as if the tears had got squeezed until they cracked open. I was angry. Nearly as angry as I had been at Inquisitor Oberon. I felt like I might split open right down the middle of my sternum. I haven't done anything wrong. Having somebody try to kill you doesn't make you a criminal. Spindle snorted. Sure. Take that to the constables, see how far you get. It was the last straw. You know what? Maybe I will. I scrambled to my feet. The gingerbread man shifted hastily to hang on. What? Mona, no. I will go to the constables. You're just paranoid and think because you're a street rat, everybody's like you. Which wasn't fair, and I felt guilty immediately. But the angry squeezing in my chest wouldn't let me stop. I stomped to the burlap curtain and wrenched it aside. Spindle balled his hands into fists. Knackering Molly told us to stay here, and then she left us alone with no food and no explanation or anything. I did feel a little guilty about leaving, but mostly I just felt mad. Why shouldn't I go to the constables? I'd never committed a crime in my life, not unless you count filching cookies from the case, and I'd baked those cookies in the first place. That didn't really count. It was no wonder people like Spindle and Knackering Molly were paranoid, but I was a respectable citizen. The constables were there to protect me. I stalked into the street. Mona, don't be stupid. Spindle tried to get in front of me, but I shouldered past him. You're going to be in big trouble. Content warning, Karen. I demand to speak to your manager. We were on the edge of the rat's nest. I should have been scared, but the anger was still doing all the talking. If I'd been thinking clearly, I would probably have tried to find the safest way out. But instead, I just picked the direction I thought was right and ploughed forwards, ignoring the scampering of sentries and the puzzled faces watching me. Mona! The alleyway took a couple of zigzag turns. As if I'd had the sense to be scared, I wouldn't have made at least 2 of those, which were prime ambush spots, and probably only the fact that I so clearly had nothing worth stealing kept me from getting mugged right there, then spilled out onto Varley Street. I stomped onto the sidewalk. Spindle halted at the mouth of the alley and made a grab for the back of my jacket, but missed. Varley is a broad avenue running along the canal. It's usually full of street musicians because the sidewalks are wider than usual, but it was still so early that hardly anybody was about yet. I could hear someone tuning their fiddle a little way away. A few cautious notes, then a halt, and a few more random notes, then another halt, splattering like drops of rain against the stones. But I wasn't looking for a street musician. I was looking for a constable. And there was one, leaning against a lamppost across the street about half a block up the road. I broke into a run. Here now, what's the trouble? asked the constable, startled as I raced up to him. "You have to help me!" I was panting. He wasn't one of the men who patrolled our neighbourhood, but he was wearing the uniform, and he had a broad, kind face. "Please! Of course I will, love," he said promptly. "What's wrong?" "Somebody tried to kill me." I waved my hands. "It was the spring green man. He was wearing green. I was in the bakery, and he had a knife. Tried to kill you." His eyebrows rose sharply. "Spring green. Mercy me." He put an arm around my shoulders. "Here now. It's all right, love. I'm sure there's been some sort of misunderstanding. Just come with me, and we'll get this all sorted out." I felt the knot in my stomach loosen. This was exactly what I wanted. Some responsible grown-up to get it all sorted out, so I could go back to my normal life and make cinnamon rolls. "It'll be fine now, Mona," said the constable. "Never you worry." He turned, still with the arm around my shoulders, so I had to turn with him. He cupped his free hand to his mouth. "Hello!" he called. Up and down the road, a few more blocks over, another constable answered. "Hello!" How had he known my name? He was holding me awfully tightly, and I squirmed a bit, but his grip didn't loosen, and I suddenly felt very, very cold. Because I was pretty sure that I hadn't told him my name at all. I squirmed harder and tried to pull away, and he grabbed my wrist in one hand. It wasn't too painful. I really don't think he was trying to hurt me, but he wasn't letting go either. "Hold still, love," he said, trying to sound stern and reassuring all at once. "We've got orders to bring you in if you turn up. Somebody wants to talk to you, that's all." "Let go! I haven't done anything wrong." "Then you've got nothing to be afraid of," said the constable. "Stop that, girl. I'm not going to hurt you." "Then let go!" I kicked him in the shins. He grunted. "Now don't be like..." He never finished saying what I wasn't supposed to be like, as two things happened simultaneously. Spindle slammed into the back of the constable's knees, and the gingerbread man launched himself off my shoulder and went for his eyes. He fell down with a wild yelp, batting the enraged cookie aside. Spindle rolled out from under the man's legs and scrambled to his feet. I snatched my tiny gingerbread protector from the cobbles. The fall had knocked one of his icing buttons loose, but he was otherwise unharmed, and turned to run. There was another constable hurrying towards us from down the street. He'd gotten close enough to see that something was happening. I turned the other way, and Spindle grabbed my elbow and yelled, "This way!" We raced up Varley Street and across a footbridge. We had barely reached the far end when I heard footsteps pounding on it. I looked back. There were 3 guards chasing us now. "Oh God, you were right," I moaned as we ducked into an alley and ran down it, jumping over old boxes and broken crates. Rats scampered out of our way, chittering angrily. "Spindle, you were right." Pardon me. "Told you so," he panted. "Probably all got orders last night." There was a constable at the end of the alley. He said, "Here now," but Spindle went right and I went left, and he missed both of us. I flung myself through a gap in a courtyard fence that was too narrow for a grown-up. It was almost too narrow for me, and Spindle was right behind me while the constable growled and rattled at the gate. "Over the back wall," said Spindle. "Hurry!" Punching dough for hours a day gives you pretty strong arms, but it still wasn't easy to get over the wall. Spindle had to actually get under me and shove my legs upwards. It would have been embarrassing, but when you're running for your life, you tend not to worry about these things. "I see you, Anil. I see you." The road we came out on was clear, but I could hear "hello" and "they went this way" echoing down the streets. They were between us and the rat's nest. I could tell Spindle wasn't sure where to go next, and my heart was hammering against my ribcage until I thought it might explode. We skidded through an intersection, past the fiddle player whose instrument let out a very unmusical squawk as we tore past her. "I see them! There!" If only there had been more people about, we might have lost ourselves in the crowd. If it had been darker, we might have been able to hide. If I wasn't a stubborn, hard-headed idiot, we wouldn't be in this mess in the first place. Another bridge loomed out of the early morning gloom. "Down!" hissed Spindle, and wrenched me sideways. There was a water stair there, a set of steps cut into the concrete, leading down into the canal. The water stairs lead to tunnels where the sewer workers can get into the trains, presumably to clear out rats and zombie crayfish, and to make sure the sewers aren't going to collapse under us. I know Spindle was thinking that maybe we could get into the trains and lose the constables that way, and it was a good plan. It was a really clever plan, except for the enormous locked grate. under the bridge. Spindle rattled the bars futilely. The padlock had a latch as thick around as my thumb. There was no way we were breaking through it. "Can you pick that?" "Sure, if I've got time." "Hello!" sounded directly over our heads. "They're on the bridge," I whispered. "They'll be down here in a minute," Spindle whispered. "Can you swim?" "Oh." You don't swim in the canals. Not unless you're a duck, and even the ducks probably don't enjoy it much. Whenever it rains, the sewers overflow directly into the canal. At high summer, the city stinks in ways that even poets can't describe, and that's not even including the stuff that people dump in there as a matter of course. We get our waters from wells, not from the canals. You jump in the canal if you're trying to kill yourself, not if you want to go for a swim. "No," I said. "Can you?" "Not really." "Did you see 'em?" asked a constable at the far end of the bridge. "They didn't come by me." "Can you magic us out then?" asked Spindle, rolling his eyes wildly at the sound of the voices. "Bread! I work with bread! Only bread!" Spindle slapped his pockets and came up with the half loaf I'd given him yesterday. "All right, now what?" He looked so expectant that I didn't know whether to cry or hit him. "Now nothing! I can't do anything. I mean, maybe if you could get them to eat it." I had a sudden absurd image of Spindle throwing bits of bread to the constables, and the men quacking like ducks as they fought for the floating scraps. I could feel hysterical laughter welling up in my throat and crushed it. I will have plenty of time to go mad with terror after they've caught me. And then that stupid image of the constables in the water and the scraps of floating bread caught me, and I didn't feel the urge to laugh anymore. Floating bread. Floating bread. "Give me the bread," I said. "Check the water stair," called one of the constables. "They might have gone to ground. Half a loaf, not sliced." Well, that was easy enough. I held the stale bread in both hands and suggested that maybe it was tired of being in one piece. It resisted for only a moment, then fell apart in exactly even slices. It took me a week last autumn to learn how to make bread slice itself. I made a lot of ragged stumps at first, and it's a good thing Aunt Tabitha believed in me, because we had to put about 50 mangled loaves on the discount pile and make a whole lot more into bread pudding before I got the hang of it. I still tend to leave pretty thick end pieces, but I'm a lot faster than using a knife. I made 5 good-sized slices, and we probably only need 4, so nobody would be stuck with the heel, and they were stale already, and as I held them I told them to get even staler, to get so hard that they were practically stone. This bread wouldn't dissolve in water. This bread hated water. Water was the enemy. "Float," I ordered the bread. "No matter how heavy you get, float." There was a clatter as one of the constables started down the water stair. "Here," I told Spindle, handing him 2 of the slices. "I don't know how we'll stay on them, but it's the best we've got." The constable peered into the gloom and cried, "Hey, you there, come on!" I set the bread into the murky green water, took a deep breath, and stepped out onto it. 1 foot on each slice. We were much too heavy, of course. It's impossible to float on bread, which is why magic had to get involved. "Hold us up," I ordered the bread. "Don't sink." If you have ever tried to stay afloat on a pair of magic bread slices, then you know what it was like. Otherwise, all I can say is that I do not recommend it. The slices were from one of our big sourdough rounds, so they were a pretty good size, but my feet still stuck out a little over the crust. Staying balanced was nearly impossible. It was like trying to walk on moving ice. 1 foot went one way, the other foot went the other way, and I nearly went down into the sludge. Then I overcompensated and nearly went down the other way as my left foot shot out from under me. Spindle caught on quicker than I did. He had both slices in the water and a foot on each slice before I'd managed to get my balance back. The constable stared at me. He could probably have reached out and grabbed me, but honestly he was too flabbergasted. His mouth hung open and his eyebrows were so high they'd vanished under his hair. You'd think he'd never seen anybody ride bread before. The gingerbread man put his hands to either side of his head and made faces at the constable, as best you can when you do not have a tongue to stick out. There is a river somewhere that flows into the city, breaking into all the canals, and that river flows eventually into the sea. This means that there is a vague current. It carried us away, not too swiftly, while Spindle and I flailed and rocked and tried not to fall in, and the constable stared after us as if we'd grown wings. But it worked. That was the thought that kept going through my mind. It's working, sweet lady of sorrowful angels, it's working. The bread was stale enough. My magic was strong enough. We floated on the surface of the water, and even though it splashed over the sides occasionally and soaked our shoes, the bread continued to float. Look out! The current was pushing Spindle into me. I tried to get out of the way, but Bread isn't very good at evasive manoeuvres. At the last second, I leaned one way and he leaned the other, and we passed with an inch or two to spare. It didn't get any easier to ride, but we did get a little better at it. The best way was to crouch down with your knees close together, so that you didn't slide too far to either side and risk having your feet go out from under you. There were pilings in the water that were harder to navigate around, but you could grab onto them to steady yourself, so they were actually more help than harm. I think the bread caught on to what we were doing and tried to steady us too. I'm not saying bread is intelligent, mind you, but magic is. At one point, an eddy caught one of my slices, and it was either turn around with it or fall off completely. So I turned. A line of constables was just visible on the bridge, all staring after us with identical expressions of stunned dismay. One broke away and started running down the road, trying to keep pace with us, but the road turned, and we floated between a row of houses that came right up to the canal's edge. The gingerbread man on my shoulder waved to our pursuer as we drifted out of sight. "We're getting away," Spindle cried. "We're actually really getting away. On bread." "We are," I said, "but we should find some place to get off soon. I don't know how long I can keep magicking this bread from getting soggy. I don't want them to get any bright ideas about nets." Spindle nodded. "Or crossbows," he added grimly. Crossbows? They wouldn't shoot us, would they? I mean, we hadn't... "Somebody wants to talk to you," the constable had said. What if that somebody was Inquisitor Oberon? What if nothing? Who else could it be? There was a grate ahead where the canal ran under street level. The grates were wide enough for two kids to pass through, although I had a bad moment when each of my slices went on a different side of a bar, and I had to grab the bar and swing awkwardly around it to keep from falling over. The ceiling on the other side was low and furred with moss. I could hear dripping sounds from all directions. Spindle and I crouched over our bread and let the canal carry us down the tunnel of dark water. And that's chapter 12.